"Hello, Clarice?" That single line, delivered in Anthony Hopkins' icy voice, has echoed across decades. The Silence of the Lambs is more than just a movie. It is one of the rare psychological thrillers that crossed into mainstream legend, terrifying audiences and fascinating critics. Released on Valentine's Day in 1991, it quickly became one of the most celebrated horror films in history. But while most people remember Hannibal Lecter's piercing stare or Buffalo Bill's disturbing basement, very few know the twisted, bizarre, and almost unbelievable stories that happen behind the scenes. The truth is, the making of The Silence of the Lambs was nearly as disturbing as the story itself. From casting chaos, to on-set mind games, to shocking inspirations ripped straight from real crimes, the untold story of this film is darker than you think. Let's pull back the curtain. The book that started it all. Before Hannibal Lecter ever stared into the eyes of Clarice Starling on screen, he was a creation of novelist Thomas Harris. Harris introduced the character in his 1981 book, Red Dragon. That was the true beginning of Lecter's legend, though it would take another story to immortalize him. In 1988, Harris released The Silence of the Lambs. This time, Lecter played a central role in the story of an FBI trainee hunting a serial killer. Just 3 years later, the book became the film we know today. But Harris himself? He never watched the movie. Not once. Why? According to director Jonathan Demme, Harris didn't want his mental image of his characters, these twisted, detailed people he had built in his imagination, to be replaced by actors on a screen. He had seen a friend go through that exact struggle after watching an adaptation of his own book. The images from the film had polluted his mental landscape, making it impossible to continue his series the way he wanted. Harris vowed never to make that mistake. So even though The Silence of the Lambs became a worldwide phenomenon, Harris stuck to his own imagination, never letting Hopkins or Foster overwrite the Lecter and Clarice he carried in his mind. And here's the irony. Harris's refusal didn't stop his work from becoming legendary. He went on to publish 6 novels in total, 4 of them starring Lecter. Every single one was adapted into film. But to Harris, Hannibal would always be the man on the page, not the monster we saw on screen. But while Harris was cautious, Hollywood was messy, and the road from book to movie was far from smooth. Casting chaos. Believe it or not, The Silence of the Lambs almost looked completely different. In fact, the role of Hannibal Lecter nearly belonged to Gene Hackman. Hackman, riding high on his acting career in the late 1980s, bought the rights to Harris's book for $500,000, splitting the cost with Orion Pictures. His plan? To direct the movie himself and possibly even star in it. At first, he thought he might play Lecter, then considered taking the role of FBI agent Jack Crawford instead. He even imagined John Hurt as Lecter and Michelle Pfeiffer as Clarice. But here's where things turned strange. Hackman's daughter read the book and told him point blank, "You are not making this movie." The darkness of the story disturbed her so deeply that Hackman backed out. Some say it was his daughter's words. Others claim he was simply too busy with other projects. Either way, Hackman sold his rights back to Orion, and history shifted. With Hackman gone, the search for Clarice began. Jodie Foster desperately wanted the role. She had already read the book and was convinced she was the perfect choice. But Jonathan Demme, the director, wasn't sure. He thought Foster's Boston accent, which she'd shown in The Accused, might be distracting. His first choice was Michelle Pfeiffer. Pfeiffer, however, took one look at the script and said no. She called it too dark, too evil. She didn't want to spend months immersed in that kind of material. Demme then turned to Meg Ryan. She also declined, saying it was far too grisly. Laura Dern's name floated around as well, but the studio felt she wasn't a big enough star. Finally, with every other option gone, Foster landed the role she had been fighting for. And thank goodness she did. Foster later said that playing Clarice was a dream. Because for the first time in her career, she wasn't just the victim. She got to fight back. As for Hannibal, the casting chaos there was even stranger. In 1986, the film Manhunter had already featured Lecter, played by Brian Cox. But the film flopped. When Demme began casting The Silence of the Lambs, he wanted a new face. His first pick? Sean Connery. But when Connery read the script, he called it revolting and walked away. That rejection opened the door for Anthony Hopkins. At the time, Demme worried Hopkins wasn't a big enough box office name, but Hopkins got the script, read it, and knew instantly this was his role. The rest, as they say, is chilling history. But Hopkins didn't just play Hannibal, he became him. And that transformation is where the story gets unsettling. Becoming Hannibal. Anthony Hopkins understood something most actors miss. Terror doesn't come from gore, it comes from subtlety. One of his creepiest tricks was also one of the simplest. He decided Hannibal would rarely blink. Inspired by reptiles, like crocodiles, that seemed to stare endlessly without flinching, Hopkins trained himself to hold eye contact unnaturally long. The result was terrifying. Every time he looked at someone, the audience felt trapped in his gaze. Hopkins also went off script in surprising ways. During his very first meeting with Jodie Foster, he mocked her accent. Foster, caught completely off guard, was genuinely hurt. She had always been insecure about her accent, and suddenly Hannibal Lecter was tearing her down. Her reaction on screen, the mix of anger and vulnerability, was completely real. Foster later thanked Hopkins for it, admitting that moment liberated her. If she could hold her ground against Lecter, she could hold her ground against anyone. Hopkins also made one of the most iconic lines in film even creepier. The moment Hannibal says he ate a liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti, Hopkins followed it with that eerie slurping noise. That wasn't in the script. It was pure improvisation, inspired by old horror films like Dracula. And here's something shocking. Hopkins is only on screen for about 16 minutes in the entire film. Yet his performance was so intense that he won the Academy Award for Best Actor. It was one of the shortest screen times ever to win. But his immersion in Hannibal had consequences. Hopkins was dating Martha Stewart at the time, and their relationship ended after the film. Why? Because she couldn't look at him without seeing Hannibal Lecter. The performance was so convincing that it poisoned his real-life romance. Hopkins had become Hannibal. But he wasn't the only one blurring the line between fiction and reality. Buffalo Bill's dark inspiration. While Hannibal chilled audiences with his calm intelligence, Buffalo Bill horrified them with raw brutality. What many people don't realize is that Buffalo Bill was not entirely fictional. He was a disturbing patchwork of real killers. Thomas Harris drew from Ed Gein, who skinned his victims and used their flesh to make lampshades and clothing. From Gary Heidnik, who kept women trapped in a basement. And from Ted Bundy, who lured victims by faking an injury. Together, those traits created Buffalo Bill, a man who wanted to make a woman's suit from human skin. Actor Ted Levine brought Bill to life in ways no one expected. One of the most infamous scenes, Bill dancing in front of a mirror in a silk robe, wasn't in the script. Levine improvised it, fueled by a few shots of tequila. He even suggested the song Goodbye Horses by Q Lazarus. That choice gave the scene its haunting power. Filming also carried eerie coincidences. The house used as Buffalo Bill's home was located in Levine's actual hometown. Even stranger, it was right next door to his childhood sweetheart's house. For Levine, playing the darkest role of his career felt uncomfortably close to home. And then there was Brooke Smith, who played Catherine, the woman trapped in the pit. To land the role, she had to gain 25 pounds. She also locked herself in her parents' basement closet to prepare for the claustrophobia, but the psychological toll was heavy. Smith later admitted she was struggling with depression during filming, even experiencing thoughts of ending her life. In a strange way, Playing Catherine forced her to confront those feelings head-on. The role became a turning point, pushing her to seek help. Buffalo Bill was fiction, but the pain behind the character was all too real. And on set, the cast and crew needed a way to cope. Set secrets and crew oddities. Imagine working every day on a film about cannibals, serial killers, and human skin. The atmosphere could have been unbearable. But director Jonathan Demme had a solution. He kept the set lighthearted whenever possible. The crew even invented a board game to pass the time. They called it the Gum Game, where the goal was to save Catherine from Buffalo Bill's pit. The cards included absurd things like liposuction, go back 2 spaces. It was morbid humor, but it kept them sane. There were also strange cameos. In one scene, when Clarice is being pulled away from Hannibal in Memphis, a man in the background appears briefly. That man was George Romero, the filmmaker behind Night of the Living Dead. It was a small detail, but fitting Romero, the king of zombies, sneaking into a story about cannibalism. Even the poster carried secrets. The iconic image shows Clarice's face covered by a death's head moth. Look closely, and the skull on the moth's back isn't really a skull at all. It's a photograph of 7 naked women arranged in the shape of one. The design was inspired by Salvador Dalí and photographer Philippe Halsman. Subtle, disturbing, and unforgettable. Everywhere you looked, The Silence of the Lambs carried hidden layers, but its impact wouldn't just stay on set. It would explode into Hollywood history, controversy, and legacy. Horror films rarely win big at the Academy Awards. They are often dismissed as low art, good for scares, but not for prestige. The Silence of the Lambs changed that forever. At the 1992 Oscars, the film did the unthinkable. It won all 5 major awards: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Adapted Screenplay. Only 2 films had ever achieved this before. It Happened One Night in 1934, and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in 1975. No film has done it since. The film's success shocked even its creators. Demme himself admitted he thought it would barely cover its production costs. Instead, it grossed nearly $273 million worldwide. But the legacy wasn't just glory. For many, the film stirred controversy. Its portrayal of Buffalo Bill drew criticism from LGBTQ activists who felt the character reinforced negative stereotypes. Debates still rage today over whether the film stigmatized trans identities or if it was strictly about Bill's madness. And yet, despite the debates, the film's cultural footprint only grew. Sequels followed Hannibal in 2001, Red Dragon in 2002, and Hannibal Rising in 2007. None ever matched the power of the original. Jodie Foster even refused to return for Hannibal, passing the torch to Julianne Moore. Perhaps the strangest twist of all came in 2005, when Silence, the musical, premiered at the New York International Fringe Festival. Yes, a comedy musical based on Hannibal Lecter. Against all odds, it was a hit, even winning awards. Time magazine later named it one of the top 10 plays of 2011. Imagine that a story so horrifying, it somehow inspired laughter. Conclusion. So what makes The Silence of the Lambs endure? It's not just the shocking story of a cannibal psychiatrist. It's the way the film blurred boundaries between horror and prestige, between fiction and reality, between fear and fascination. Behind the camera, Gene Hackman almost changed everything. Jodie Foster fought for the role of her life. Anthony Hopkins transformed himself into a monster so convincingly that it cost him his relationship. Buffalo Bill carried the shadows of real killers, leaving scars on the actors who portrayed him. And through it all, the crew laughed, played games, and slipped hidden secrets into posters and cameos. 30 years later, the film still unsettles us because it reminds us of something terrifying. Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a polite man in a glass cell, staring at you without blinking. So here's the question. Which behind-the-scenes truth shocked you the most? Was it Hopkins' chilling transformation, Buffalo Bill's real-life inspirations, or the fact that the movie nearly starred Sean Connery instead? Let us know in the comments. And remember, when you watch The Silence of the Lambs again, the scariest part might not be the movie at all. It might be knowing what really happened when the cameras stopped rolling.